The culture war has had so many different variations and iterations over the past few decades in the West and Western civilization, especially in America, which really I believe America is the locus of where the culture war is. But it seems that in recent times things have come to a head, and a lot of folks, primarily due to the amplifying effect of social media, are feeling as if the culture has degraded to such a extent that the culture war is now more necessary than it ever has been. And I think a few weeks ago, as of the posting of this video, there was a instance that made a lot of folks feel like this. At the 2023 Grammy Awards show, which I didn't really watch, and I don't really watch those kind of shows, I think, again, those shows and their popularity are a symptom of a broader cultural malady that everyone who watches them should actually try to consider. Why would you want to take your attention away from things that may be meaningful, or things that may even be happy diversions, and get lost into the world of the artificial and the superficial? What are these people getting awards for? They're getting awards for creating something, and what they create typically is not of the highest quality these days. And that's a very different conversation for a different day. But the Grammys were held, and Sam Smith, who is sort of a contemporary pop star, he's certainly quite popular with people of my generation. I remember when he came out as a singer, performed his song called Unholy, which happens to be a quite popular song right now, and he danced around, dressed up like Satan, and had like a sort of occult ritualistic circle around him while him and Kate Petra performed the chart-topping song. And of course, the outrage and backlash to this was immense. Everyone from Senator Ted Cruz to Matt Walsh to other personalities and figures in the conservative movement, even people like Piers Morgan, all across the political spectrum, had reactions of disgust, of criticism, of anger, calling it tasteless, and many of them said it is time to take the culture war even more seriously. Now, while this occurs, because this video is not about the Grammy performance, I think that it is a mistake to focus on one incident and say, this is where our attention should be if we're going to understand what's going on. That's an absolute mistake. Typically, incidences are merely a microcosm of a broader principle, and I think the broader principle here will actually help us deal with the root of the anger, of the outrage, and articulate why things like that reflect a broader cultural problem. So, right now, as that performance happened, there are several things occurring in the West that are quite outrageous and grave. The annihilation of womanhood, for example, the fact that postmodernists have hijacked institutions of higher education, of higher learning, the media. They've hijacked so many different social and cultural institutions, and they are trying to bend them into an anti-truth, anti-reason method of being to articulate their idea of the world. The fact that education is also being overran by these ideas. The fact that centralization of authority has come back in roaring fashion, perhaps in the greatest way than it has ever since the New Deal, with what happened during COVID and the seizure of churches and shutting down of churches, and this sort of reevaluation of the relationship around man and the state. There are just so many different things going on in the culture. The fact that the idea of childhood, which used to mean an innocent state of development, is now being redefined and reworked in political terms by certain individuals who believe that children have the ability and should have the ability to experience things that are not appropriate for their condition. So many of these various disconnected strands in the culture are weaving together into this single mass, if we really look at it, and causing a lot of anxiety. The real culture war, my friends, is not merely things that may be tasteless, like Sam Smith's performance. It's not things that shock our sensibilities, like the fact that morbid obesity is now being revered in our culture as self-acceptance and self-love, when in fact it is the opposite of both of those things. The true culture war is the conflict, the tension, the dialectic between man's emotions and his ability to reason soundly. The true culture war will always be fought in that tension between the passions and reason. When we understand this, everything that I just mentioned to you is put into a broader context, which helps us understand it better. Because a lot of folks simply say this is evidence of degradation. Degradation of what? Why have we gotten to a point as a culture where something like Sam Smith's performance is glorified and praised in roaring fashion? Why have we gotten to a point as a culture where the idea of a child being innocent is no longer accepted as undisputed fact? Why have we gotten to a point in our culture where unhealthy practices are being glorified and revered in the name of self-love when it is the opposite of that? Why have we gotten to a point? Because of the tension of emotions, the passions, and reason, and the passions winning out over reason. Allow me to explain this concept in a bit more detail. Before we can understand how the passions and reason interact and form the basis for the culture war, we have to understand what culture actually is. And so to do that, let's go to my handy-dandy etymology handbook, where I can give you guys the history and the foundational root definitions of the word culture. According to the general etymology, culture, the word culture, emerged really in the 15th century from the Latin word cultura, which meant to cultivate agriculture figuratively. And then this version of the word kind of developed as time moved on, and by around 1805, it meant to sort of learn and have a taste and experience the intellectual side of civilization. Then that the 1800s progressed, and it began to mean sort of collective customs and achievements of a people, sort of collective intellectual development. So culture, in its very base sense, means to cultivate. And to cultivate what? Historically, that cultivation has been associated with intellect. And historically, at least in the West, intellect has been associated with some kind of virtue or some kind of higher understanding. So culture, in its strictest sense, means to cultivate intellect within the man, to cultivate refinement within the man, and perhaps to lead him to virtue. And culture are the activities, ways, and customs that happens. Now, of course, this is a very strict definition. There may be definitions that are analogous to this that may be a little bit more, let's say, broader, but fundamentally, I believe it connects to the same core meaning. Culture are activities that cultivate something. Now, when the intellect, reason being the engine of the intellect, you cannot use your intellect, which simply means your ability to think, without using reason. If you forget reason and you don't use reason, then the intellect becomes functionally useless, because reason quite literally processes and interprets the content of your thoughts. The moment reason is no longer applied to the intellect, there is a different impulse that takes hold, and that is the impulse of the passions. That is the impulse of emotion, because there are two dominant forces within the soul of a man: his ability to think and his ability to feel. When his ability to think no longer has the tower of reason guarding it from the excesses of his ability to feel, the ability to feel has the ability to invade his thinking and twist and warp his mind in ways that are unbecoming of a human being. Man is distinguished from the animals due to his ability to think rationally. Animals, beasts, are creatures of intuition, creatures of instinct, creatures of passion. All of them have a basic drive of self-preservation, but they don't manifest those drives in rational ways. A human being may look at a shadow on the wall and think, oh, this is interesting. An animal may look at that same shadow and try to catch it or play with it, because the animal doesn't have the ability to reason, to think rationally. It is motivated by instinct, and in that case, it's the prey, or rather the predator instinct, to catch things, which is tied to their ability to survive. So, if we understand these as the basis of man's soul, as the basis of man's being, then we should understand that a culture which cultivates the intellect, that no longer does that, quite literally opens up the floodgates for one's thinking to become warped and twisted in ways that literally degrade their humanity. Public education has a way of doing this, or has had a way of doing this throughout history, because public education has had this way, at least in America, of putting things into simplified boxes, into concise narratives crafted by the educators, in this case, crafted by state and federal governments. This has been the case for a long time. This is essentially what propaganda is if you look at it functionally. And so when you have a culture that has been for a long time assailed by the sort of anti-intellectual forces of government-mandated public education, which teaches some things that are up for dispute, or some things that are not necessarily entirely founded, and those things are accepted as truth by force of the government, then you have a culture that no longer really prides thinking. When you have a culture that prides looking at authority as a sort of indispensable arbiter of what is true and what is not true, the Prime Minister of New Zealand literally said recently, if the government does not say it, it is not true. Now, most people are not dumb enough to say something like that, which boggles the mind, but many governments in the West, especially America's government, have functioned like this, and the evidence of them functioning like this exists during the COVID-19 catastrophes, the medical tyranny sicked upon the American people by Anthony Fauci, by other folks who literally proclaim themselves to be the human embodiments of science, which simply means, in a functional sense, in a practical sense, they are the authority, you listen to them. This mindset has been instilled in the American populace for decades, whether it be with the invention of the DHS, Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, the Patriot Act, and so many other advances on the privacy of Americans from the federal government. This mentality, going all the way back to the Progressive Era, going all the way back to the New Deal, the Great Society, where the presumption of self-preservation was removed from the individual and placed into the hands of the all-caring state, and then used in ways that politicians deem necessary. In the case of the Great Society, or in the case of the New Deal, it was used to create a floundering welfare state, which tore apart families, which destroyed the independence of so many Americans, which added a lot of money to the American debt, which reinvented the ways America think about the economy and economic action in a way that gives authority more power. The Great Society, which also did the same kind of thing. So, if we understand that the Western culture, especially American culture, has been trending towards authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and centralized control for the past few decades, we can then understand the root of so many problems in the culture war. Because when you have a culture that emphasizes the importance of certain institutions, like certain media institutions and government institutions, and the role of dispensing truth and providing information, and for a long time has believed those to be indispensably correct, you're going to have a culture that does not pride thinking. Now, beyond the American society's relationship with government and institutions of cultural authority, there is another enemy that has destroyed the sort of emphasis on reason and truth in the West, and that enemy has invaded those institutions, and this enemy is postmodernism. Many of you may know postmodernism as the woke ideology, as wokeism, as social justice, all of which are derivatives of some element of postmodern thought. Critical race theory, for example, are derivatives of Foucaultian power dynamics interpreted into political language. That's all it is. For those of you who do not know who Foucaultian is, Michel Foucault was a French theorist who essentially believed that all social relationships are reduced to power, and if you understand power, you understand society, and critical race theory says all social relationships in America are reduced to power and privilege, race being the domineering characteristic. That's one example. Another example is the gender anarchy that's going on right now. The idea that a woman can be anything that I so please it, because gender is a social construct. This comes from the thinking of Jacques Lacan, a Freudian psychoanalyst, who Judith Butler in the 90s interpreted all of his writings to then mean and form the basis of her thought, which basically says sex is not really biological. and of course, this has translated into the modern era, the social media era, as the pronoun situation, as a sort of gender anarchy. All of these different things come together from intellectual seeds, or rather anti-intellectual seeds planted long ago. Here's the point. If these ideas, which are anti-reason, anti-truth, anti-objective reality, can become a mainstay in so many institutions, can become the subjects of gender departments at universities, can become the emphasis for diversity programs across corporate America and across federal and state governments, can become the cause célèbre for so many people, so many cultural activists on the left, then how in the world do you expect reason and a sort of dispassionate understanding of how things work to be present? When things become about lived experience and subjectivism and my truth, which has been the direction our culture has been trending to epistemologically for the past few years, all born of the ideas that I mentioned a few moments ago, how can you have an emphasis on reason when logic itself, one of the functions of logic, mathematics, is called white supremacist and racist by these same people who push the primacy of subjectivism over reason and truth? How in the world can you have a culture which prides sound thinking? Let's go back to the example I used earlier. There are two dominant impulses in man: his ability to think, his ability to feel. And right now in our culture, the ability to think has been torn down, diluted, and infected with anti-intellectual, anti-human ideas, which are born from a subjective interpretation of the world, which is not realistic, and upon scrutiny falls apart. And yet, that is the dominant mode of our culture. That is the culture war. Sam Smith shaking his ass and pretending to be Satan is not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is why that appeals to some people and why they are willing to use that as a political statement, as some kind of value statement. Excuse my language, but I have to be visceral in my verbiage to convey this point. America was not built off of brass and blood. America was built off of intellection and virtue. The founding generation understood that understanding certain concepts, reading, studying, and applying those concepts to the practical stuff of life, to the practical matters of life, are where a society is built and a sound political system based on moral first principles springs forth. But for those principles to be sustained practically, they must be appreciated by virtuous people. They must be appreciated by the culture. Unfortunately, the culture war has become much more about owning the libs, dunking on people, the belligerent, brash stuff of life, and less about thinking and reflecting and understand the dichotomy between man and his emotions. All of us should understand the impact that public education and the primacy of centralized authority over the past 80 or so years of American life has had on the American public's ability to think. The impact that propaganda has had on the American public's ability to think. The impact that these sort of standardized cultural notions produced by Hollywood have had on the American public's ability to think. The fact that the journalism industry, the biggest dispenser of information on the planet, writes at a 4th or 5th grade reading level, because that's what they have become accustomed to, and that's what the public has become accustomed to in general. All of these things are the seeds of an impending cultural battle. And you don't fight the culture war by screaming and screeching and clutching your pearls. You fight the culture war by defaulting the first principles. You don't fight the culture war by having an own the libs mentality and wanting to rather forcefully use the government to pursue your own political aims. You fight the culture war by understanding the necessary separation between the power of the government and the freedom of society, and trying to realign those values in the minds of the public because they have been bent out of contour. You don't fight the culture war by being meme lords. You fight the culture war by intelligently using the constructs of the digital age for higher purposes. Until the right understands this very basic principle, the culture war will remain unwinnable. People will continue to say that the snootiness of conservatives turns them away, and it will all just be fruitless. But I believe if people go back to the first principles of reality and understand that those are the basis by which any coherent political or social analysis is made, then things won't be perfect. There will still be folks who disagree, and that's fine. It's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. A free society is a conduit of pluralism, and pluralism is a conduit of dissent and discourse, and dissent and discourse are a conduit of discovery, and discovery leads us to the truth. So, by virtue of necessity, we need those things to happen. But what we don't need is for lived experience and subjective truth, that oxymoron that it is, to become the dominant modes of our day. The true culture war is in here. The true culture war, you have much more power over it than you think. Which direction will you go? Will you be a thinking man looking at things pensively, trying to understand the nuances of certain issues of our political and social era? Or will you be a man of either political side, motivated by passion, by anger, by bestial primal humanity, rejecting your higher self for the sake of a few dopamine hits? The choice is yours. My friends, I love you guys so much. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, comment on this video. Please be sure to support me on Patreon, PayPal, join my Discord. All of that is in the comment section down below. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.